All right, everyone, this is Mr. Vanderpool. Today we're going to go ahead and be talking about fiscal policy. So when we're looking at fiscal policy, we're looking at things that the federal government can do, specifically the President of the United States and the Congress, to fight economic problems like recession and inflation using two different tools, government spending and taxes. So when the Congress and the President uses government spending and taxes to fight inflation and recession, that is called fiscal policy. All right, so before we go into fiscal policy, let's go ahead and talk about the goal of fiscal policy, which is to get back to full employment. So remember, full employment equilibrium exists where aggregate demand intersects short aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply at the same point. So let's go over our ADAS graph. We have price level on our y-axis. We have real GDP on our x-axis. We have our aggregate demand curve that is downward sloping, our upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, and in this case, because we're at full employment, those are intersecting at full employment output. Okay, represented by the variable YF. Remember, at full employment output, you have 5% unemployment. You have complete efficiency. All right. So that full employment output is a very special type of output. And right above that full employment output is going to be your long run aggregate supply curve. So your goal for fiscal policy is to get back to full employment where aggregate demand and short aggregate supply are intersecting at full employment. All right, and you can see in this case when aggregate demand intersected short aggregate supply at full employment, you had an equilibrium price level represented by the variable P, and you had an equilibrium output, which is represented by the variable YF. So it's important to remember what will shift around aggregate demand, short aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. So let's go ahead and review over that. Remember, when aggregate demand can be changed by when there's a change in consumption, gross private investment, net exports, government spending. Okay, those are the things that will change around and move around aggregate demand. Those are also the same thing as the components of gross domestic product. Short aggregate supply will get shifted around by changes in input costs. You got regulation, taxes, and subsidies, which are all actually a part of what's called the legal institutional environment, and then you got short-term productivity gains will shift around that short aggregate supply curve. And the long aggregate supply curve will get shifted around by changes in technology, education, health, natural resources, and long-term permanent productivity gains. Right now, that long aggregate supply curve isn't going to shift around all that much, especially in these problems, but it's good to remember what will shift what. So today we're primarily going to be shifting around aggregate demand. So what's going to be shifting is consumption, gross private investment, net exports, and government spending. All right, so let's take a look at what is fiscal policy. This is government efforts. Generally, if you're talking about the U.S. government, it's the efforts of the President as well as the Congress to promote full employment and price stability by changing government spending, which will represent with the variable G, and or taxes, which will represent with the variable T. So recession is going to be countered with an expansionary fiscal policy. With an expansionary fiscal policy, you're going to have an increase in government spending, and you are going to have a decrease in taxes. Now, when this happens, what's going to end up happening is the government is spending a whole bunch of money, but it isn't bringing very much money in. So it's going to be creating budget deficits. Okay, an expansionary policy is going to create budget deficits. Now, economists like John Maynard Keynes say, you know what, if you're in recession, it's okay to be running these budget deficits because once you spend, the government spends all that money, gets you out of recession, that budget deficit is going to disappear. Okay, but it's important to realize that with this expansionary policy, you increase government spending, you decrease taxes. big downside is if you overdo an expansionary policy, it's going to end up causing inflation. So keep that in mind as well. So this expansionary policy is going to create a budget deficit, and if it's overdone, it might cause inflation. Okay, now let's move on to our second problem here. If we have inflation, inflation is going to be countered with a contractionary policy. And what's going to happen in a contractionary policy is you're going to decrease government spending and you're going to increase taxes. So if the government is decreasing the amount that it's spending, but it's bringing in more in taxes, this is going to lead to a budget surplus. Now, the big downside with the contractionary policy, if you overdo it, it could end up causing unemployment. Okay, but a key thing to remember is that with a contractionary policy, you're decreasing government spending and you're increasing taxes. So this is a picture of the entities that are in control of fiscal policy in the United States. That is the President as well as the Congress. Okay, they control the amount of government spending and or taxes in the U.S. economy, at least at the federal government level. So let's go ahead and look at these different policies on an aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. So let's go ahead and start off with an expansionary fiscal policy. So we're going to start off with our ADAS. We have our price level on our y-axis, real GDP on our x-axis. Notice here we have a recessionary gap. Aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are intersecting before full employment output. Our output, our equilibrium output, y, is not quite to yf. We're not quite at full employment output. So where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect, you have an equilibrium price level p, an equilibrium output y. So we are stuck in recession here, and we need to get back to full employment output. So there's a couple of things the federal government can do. One thing it can do is it can increase government spending. If it increases in government spending, that implies, okay, remember those three dots mean it implies, that aggregate demand is going to shift to the right, which is going to imply that you're going to have an increase in real GDP and an increase in the price level, and that's going to imply a drop in the unemployment rate as well as an increase in inflation. Okay, remember that the reason the unemployment rate is going down is the unemployment rate moves the opposite way of real GDP. So if real GDP is going up, there's more production, there's more hiring, which means less unemployment, so unemployment drops. Inflation rate is going to move the same way as the price level because the inflation rate is the rate of change of the price level. So if the price level is going up, the inflation rate is going to be going up as well. Okay, so the government is going to increase government spending, which shifts aggregate demand to the right, and the goal is to get it back to full employment output right there at 81. Okay, so after that increase in government spending, you can see it pushed up the price level, it pushed up output back to full employment output, which will lower the unemployment rate and raise the inflation rate. Second tool that the government can use here is it can decrease taxes. If you have a decrease in taxes, that implies that there is going to be an increase in disposable income, which implies that there's going to be an increase in consumption, which implies aggregate demand is going to shift to the right, which implies that real GDP goes up, price level goes up, which implies that the unemployment rate goes the opposite of real GDP, which is down, and the inflation rate goes the same way as price level, which is up. Okay, so two options here with the expansionary policy: increase government spending, lower taxes. But either way, the point is you want to do one of those two things, or both. Shift the aggregate demand back to full employment output. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a contractionary fiscal policy here. That would be used to actually fight inflation. So we're going to go ahead and start off with an inflationary gap. So our aggregate demand and our short aggregate supply is going to be intersecting beyond full employment output. Output is beyond full employment output. And aggregate demand, short aggregate supply are meeting beyond your long run aggregate supply curve there. Okay, so once again, we have price level on our y-axis of our real GDP. On our x-axis, we have real GDP, and our aggregate demand, short aggregate supply are intersecting beyond full employment output. And where they intersect, you have an equilibrium price level, and you have an equilibrium output y. So we're going to go ahead and use a contractionary fiscal policy to fight this inflation and move back to full employment output here. So there's a couple of things that can be done. You can lower government spending. Okay, if the President and the Congress lower government spending, that implies that aggregate demand shifts to the left, which implies that real GDP goes down and the price level goes down, which implies that the unemployment rate goes up, the opposite of GDP, and the inflation rate goes down, which is the same way as the price level. So we can go ahead and see this on our graph. So we're going to lower aggregate demand back to full employment output. Here you can see that the price level went down and the output went down as well, back to full employment output. The other option the Congress and the President has is to increase taxes. If you increase taxes, that implies you lower disposable income, which implies that consumption falls, which implies that aggregate demand shifts to the left, okay, back to full employment output, which means real GDP is going to fall, price level is going to fall, which implies that the unemployment rate moves the opposite way of real GDP, which is up. Inflation rate moves the same way as price level, which is down. Okay, so there's a contractionary fiscal policy on an ADAS. Now, fiscal policies can be broken down into what's called discretionary and automatic fiscal policies. So discretionary fiscal policies are the increasing or decrease of government spending and or taxes in order to return the economy to full employment. Okay, discretionary policy involves policymakers using fiscal policy in response to a problem. So that involves the Congress and the President seeing that there's a problem and then taking fiscal policy action to solve the problem. Okay, so an example would be several years ago, Congress and the President, actually the President introduced into Congress what was called the American Jobs Act, which contained a variety of tax cuts as well as increases in government spending. It was definitely an expansionary fiscal policy to help fight the economic doldrums at the time. So what happened there is the President as well as the Congress saw that there was a problem, and at least the President acted on it with the American Jobs Act. Okay, that is an example of discretionary fiscal policy. Now, you also have an automatic fiscal policy. So a good example of this is unemployment compensation. Unemployment compensation is an example of what's called an automatic stabilizer, which means that when people lose their jobs, they're automatically going to be getting those unemployment checks, which is the way they can use to consume. So that increase in consumption is going to go ahead and increase aggregate demand. This automatically happens. This is already built into the system. So it's a good example of an automatic policy that is going to help mitigate the effects of recession and inflation. Okay, automatic fiscal policy takes place without policymakers having to respond to current economic problems. Okay, they've already put these fiscal policies into place. So when the U.S. falls into recession, for example, you're automatically going to see this fiscal policy happen. That is an automatic fiscal policy. Now, what are some weaknesses of fiscal policy? Lags are a big one. Okay, it takes a little time to implement fiscal policy. So you've got what's called the inside lag. It takes time to recognize economic problems and to promote solution to those problems. So it takes a little time to actually recognize that there are actual economic problems in the data or in your observations or the observations of policymakers. Okay, that time that it takes to recognize the problem and then to promote solutions to that problem is what's called the inside lag. Then you have the outside lag. It takes time to actually implement the solution to the problems. And this is very high for fiscal policy, because in order to do fiscal policy, you have to have the president, you have to have the Congress act on it. So remember, you have 435 members of the House, you have 100 senators, you have one president. Okay, so some percentage of these, a high percentage of these, has to agree on some sort of policy. That can be very, very difficult to do, especially in today's political environment. So the outside lag, the time it takes to actually implement solutions to those problems, the time it takes to pass and implement that policy can be very large indeed. Now, another thing to keep in mind with fiscal policy is political motivation. So politicians face re-election, thus they are more likely to support an expansionary policy rather than a contractionary policy. Okay, remember that politicians are elected by their constituents, the people that they represent. And oftentimes, these constituents, they want more government spending. Okay, they want the government to spend money on them. Okay, they want to cut taxes. Okay, cutting taxes and increasing government spending is going to be an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so there is a huge political motivation oftentimes to do an expansionary rather than a contractionary fiscal policy. Another thing you need to keep in mind about politicians is they always are concerned about re-election. Therefore, they are always concerned about what is going on in the short term. They're not necessarily worried about the long run all that much, because they might not be in office at that time. You also got to realize that with government spending comes a lot of what's called pork barrel spending, where you've got these congressmen, these congresswomen that are spending money on projects that might not necessarily serve a huge public good, but they are projects that will bring money back to their district or back to their states.